Hey folks, welcome to Theory Thursday. In this Theory Thursday tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at two versions of Puff the Magic Dragon. And we're going to be taking a look at the chord progressions for each one. We're going to talk a little bit about how they differ and why they differ. And we're going to focus primarily on two concepts: chord substitutions and borrowed chords. To do this analysis, we're going to be using the harmonized scale, and specifically Roman numeral notation for the harmonized scale. And the harmonized scale, if you don't know what it is just ordering chords within a key, identifying the chords that belong within a key, and then ordering them according to scale degrees. The first chord, the second chord, the third chord, the fourth chord, what scale degree, where it lives in the scale. And so if you're not familiar with the harmonized scale, I did do, or if you need a refresher on it, I did do a tutorial a few weeks ago, on a Theory Thursday tutorial a few weeks ago on the harmonized scale, where I cover the scale degrees of the harmonized scale and I cover the Roman numeral notation. And since that's the language we're going to be using for this particular tutorial, if you need a refresher, you need to brush up, you need to learn, go ahead and look those up before you tackle this one. Okay, this tutorial was prompted by a buddy of mine posting the chords that he uses for Puff the Magic Dragon. And you can see that on that chord sheet, the original chords have been scratched out, and somebody has written in simplified chords. And what I mean by simplified chords is there are no bar chords, there are no seventh chords or any other extended chords. And so they've boiled Puff the Magic Dragon down to all open chord shapes. Open chord shapes with no extensions, no suspended chords, no seventh chords, no nothing. So, and in order to do this, they transposed it to the key of G, or it's written in the key of G, this chord sheet is. When I looked at this chord sheet that Gregory posted, I was comparing it to the chords that I've been playing for decades. And so we're going to take a look at these two versions, the version that Gregory posted and the version that I've always played. I don't know for a fact that my version is quote unquote correct, or it's the right one, or that it's true to the original. I think it is, but I haven't done the research to validate that these are the chords that Peter, Paul, and Mary use or not. So anyways, let's take a look at the chord progressions and compare how they differ first. And because they're in different keys, Gregory's chord sheet is in the key of G, my chord sheet is in the key of C. Let's just talk about them in terms of the harmonized scale and the scale degree that each chord sits in. So if we look at Gregory's chord sheet, it starts with a G, which is the one chord in the key of G. And then it moves to a D, which is the 5 chord in the key of G. And then it goes to a C, which is the 4 chord in the key of G. And then it goes back to G. It goes back to the 1 chord. So that first line goes 1, 5, 4, 1. So, Puff the magic dragon lived by the sea. So you can hear that it sounds right for the song, okay? It's a 1, 5, 4, 1 chord progression. The next line goes C, which, as we said, was the 4 chord, G, the 1 chord, and then it goes to E minor, which is the 6 chord, and then it goes to A major. And A major does not belong in the key of G. This is a borrowed chord. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So A should be the 2 chord, right? If G is the 1 chord, A should be the 2 chord. The 2 chord in the key of G should be a minor chord. This should be an A minor if we were going to use it as a 2 chord within the key of G. But instead we're using A major. And then it goes to D major, which is the 5 chord again. So the second line of Gregory's chord sheet goes 4, 1, 6, and then a major 2 instead of a minor 2, which is outside the key. The major 2 is outside of the key. It's outside the key. And then it goes to the 5 chord, and then the next line, of course, resolves back to a G. So we have a 4, 1, 6, major 2, and then a 5. Okay? So let's take a look at the chord sheet that I use. I'm playing this in the key of C, and so the chords that I use are C, which is the 1 chord, C, and then E minor, which is the minor 3 chord. And here's a difference from Gregory's chord sheet. Gregory's chord sheet uses the 5 chord instead of the major 3. I mean the minor 3 chord. He uses a major 5 chord instead of a minor 3 chord. So that's the chord substitution that was done, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let's finish going through. So mine, it starts with C, E minor, and then it goes to F, which is the 4 chord in the key of C, and then it goes back to C, which is the 1 chord. The next line starts with F, which is the 4 chord, goes to C, which is the 1 chord, then it goes to A minor, which is the 6 chord, and then it goes to D7, which again is a major chord. D7 is D major dominant 7. So D7 is a major chord, and in the key of C, D should be D minor. It should be a minor 2, not a major dominant 7. It should be a minor chord. So again, we have the same thing where there's a major chord, a major 2, essentially, chord being used. In this case, it's a major 2 dominant 7. D7. And then it goes to G7, which is the 5 chord. It's a 5, it's a major 5 chord dominant 7. And then, of course, the next line goes back to C for that resolution and to start the next line, right? So my chord progression goes 4, the second line goes 4, 1, 6, major 2, dominant 7, which is outside of the key. And then we go to 5, major 5, dominant 7. So in essence, our chord progressions are essentially the same chord progressions. The only difference is I'm using 7th chords, and I'll talk about why in a moment. And I'm using 7th chords, and in that first line, there is that major 5 that he plays, which ends as opposed to a minor 3rd. Okay, so now listen to both of these versions. We're going to just do that first line. And here's the way that I play it with the minor 3rd. Puff the magic dragon lives by the sea. So without the vocals, it's... Gregory's version, instead of using that E minor, the minor 3, instead of using the minor 3, he's using a major 5. So let's hear what it sounds like with a major 5. Let's hear it with the vocals. Puff the magic dragon, live by the sea. it doesn't sound wrong, right? And there is no right or wrong when it comes to music and music theory. Music theory is more of a language to talk about music than it is a set of rules. That it's not, so we're not breaking any rules by using a major 5 here, like in Gregory's chord sheet. But what we are doing is called a major minor substitution, or a minor major substitution. So by the difference between the minor 3 chord that I'm using and the major 5 chord that Gregory's chord sheet is using, the difference is one note. So in the key of C, the major 5 chord is a G, and that's made up of G, B, and D, those 3 notes, right? The minor 3 chord that I use is an E minor in the key of C, and that is made up of E, G, and B. So you can hear that it has the G and the B notes in common. The difference is the E and the D. So when we were playing a G major chord, we're playing G, B, and D. When we play an E minor chord, we're playing an E, G, and B. So the thing here is, in this particular song, an argument can be made that the E minor fits better because the melody note is an E. The melody note on Dragon, 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 is an E3. It's an E right here, which is in the E minor chord. Right? So we have the melody note within the chord. We have an E within the chord, Dragon, as opposed to Dragon. We don't have an E in the G major chord. It shares the other chord tones, the B and the G and the B, right? It shares those 2 chord tones, but it doesn't share the E, which is the melody note. So technically what is happening here is when you play a G and you sing an E, drag, you essentially have what's called a G add 6 or G6 chord. So the combination of the chord that you're playing and the melody note that you're singing is actually creating a fuller chord, an extended chord. And in this case, the extension is the add 6. So it's not just a G, it's a G add 6. So if we play Puff the Magic Dragon with the G, with the major 5, but we do it as a major 5 add 6, it would sound like... And now we have an E in it. We have an E in the chord, and so we have the melody note being included. So if we do that with the vocals, Puff the Magic Dragon, the guitar accompaniment now has a chord tone that matches the melody, if that makes sense. So the way you do major minor substitutions, and the reason for the major minor substitution, if we jump into the key of G for just a moment here, I'm trying to stick mostly to the key of C, but if we jump to the key of G for just a moment, because that's the chord sheet that Gregory posted, is in the key of G. If we were to do my version, which goes 1, major 1, minor 3, that would be G to B minor, G to B minor, which is a bar chord. And since the whole point of the simplified chord sheet that Gregory is using, the simplified chords that Gregory posted, the whole point of that is to remove bar chords and extensions and other things that make playing, and to make the song more accessible for beginners who may not have as extensive a chord library in their toolkit yet. So that's one of the reasons, perhaps, for doing a chord substitution, is to remove a chord that you physically are struggling to play if you don't have bar chords, for instance. So the way you do a major-minor substitution or a minor-major substitution is you go every other chord in the harmonized scale. So in this case, we're replacing the 3 chord with a 5 chord. If you go every other chord, so 3 and 5, 2 and 4, 4 and 6, if you go every other chord, you that pairing, the pairing of every other chord in the harmonized scale, they will share 2 notes. And so that's one of the ways you can do those substitutions. Basically what you're doing is you're finding a chord that has most of the same chord tones, and you're using that. Another way to do it, which is, I'll leave that, never mind. I'll leave that one alone for the time being. That would have been a whole other video. By going every other chord, so going from 3 to 5, or going from 5 to 3, or going from 2 to 4, or going from 4 to 2, by doing that pairing, you are keeping most of the same chord tones. So the chord sounds, quote unquote, mostly right. And again, there's no right or wrong. I just don't have another way to describe it. You're making it so that the chord substitution fits as closely as possible. It just has a difference of 1 note. Okay, so that's the major, minor, and minor, major chord substitution. And hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, please leave a question down below. I'll be happy to try to answer anything I can more thoroughly. So let's take a look at the other elephant in the room, which is what's with this major 2 chord. This song is in C major, or as in the case of Gregory's chord sheet, G major, but it's in a major key, which means that the 2 chord should be minor. Why the heck are we playing a major chord here? And in Gregory's case, he's playing a full-on major chord, no 7th. So that line sounds like this, using the just the major 2 followed by a 5, and then resolving back to the 1 at the start of the next line, right? So it goes, frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Little Jackie. So we go back to the 1 chord to start the next line, right? So I'm going to do that without the vocals. So, and here's that major 2. Now I'm not going to pause. I'm just going to play it straight through and listen to how that major 2 sounds for you. Ugh, sorry, messed up. It doesn't sound wrong. So why is it that it doesn't sound wrong? Let me play it with the D minor, and so you can think of how that sounds. And I'm gonna actually play so with a full strum, so you can hear all the strings ring at the same time. You can hear the entire chord at once instead of the finger picking. That doesn't sound as right. And part of the reason why it doesn't sound as right is like going 2 to 5. Well, actually, if I finished it back to the C, that would actually sound right. Well, listen again. Okay, so we'll go 1, 4, 1, 6, minor 2, 5. Okay, that makes it sound right. So that the minor 2 is kind of a transition chord. It builds tension. It's so close to the 1 chord that it feels like C, D minor. It feels a little tense, right? And then you go to the 5, and then back to the 1 for the resolution. So the minor 2 kind of does that. But listen again to the major 2 in this position, in that progression. It actually sounds, I think, a little bit better. And why does it work? Why is that working for us? Why is that major 2, when it should be a minor 2, why is that major 2 actually working for us? And the reason why is something called the fifth of fifths. So we know that G in the key of C is the 5 chord. And the 5 chord resolves really nicely back to the 1 chord. You hear how satisfying that is? The end. I mean, that sounds really satisfying. So that 5 chord is pulling us to the 1 chord. It's dragging our ear along to that 1 chord to give it a nice comfy place to land, right? It's pulling us in that direction. Well, the major 2 chord, the way in this case the D chord, is actually the 5 chord in the key of G. So we're basically doing 5, and then when we go to G, 1. So the end, right? It has that same feeling as going G to C. The end, the end. It has that same satisfying movement. So what we're doing here is we're pulling the listener's ear along from this major 2, but instead we're going to call it the 5th of the 5th, because G is the 5th of the C major scale, and D is the 5th of the G major scale. So it's the 5th of the 5th, if that makes sense. So we're going D, G, C. We're basically pulling ourselves along by using that 5 to 1 movement. Going from the 5th to the 1st is a very strong pull for the ear. So we're doing it 2 times in a row to really drag the listener's ear along to that resolution back to C, back to the 1 chord. So we're borrowing a chord from another scale, from another harmonized scale. We're borrowing a chord from the G major harmonized scale, and we're borrowing the 5th degree. And that moves us from that 5th degree to the 1st degree, which is G. And then we're moving within the key of C from G, which is the 5, to C, which is the 1. Does that make sense? So that's the reason why that borrowed chord works in this situation. Now you'll notice that in my chord sheet, I'm using 7 chords, right? So it's a major 2 dominant 7 chord. So that's a D7. And I'm also using a G7. Now listen, so remember how when we went from D to G, that feels pretty good, right? The end. But if we go from D7 D7, that really wants that just stopping on D7, it feels like something has to follow it. So let's go to G7. That doesn't feel done either, right? That doesn't. Then we get to C major. Now it feels done. So what the 7th chord does is it takes that concept of pulling a person's ear through, going from 5 to 1, which is actually the 5th, and which is another 5th, and then going to the 1. We're doing that 5th of 5th concept of pulling a listener's ear through back to the tonic, back to 1. We're doing that same concept, only we're using 7th chords to increase the tension and increase that pull. So, because playing it the way that Gregory's chord sheet has it, just going major 2 to 5, you could end there and be the end. You can just call that done. The end. But going to the C still works because G is resolving to the C. If you use it with the 7th chord, D7, it's not the end. No, it's still the end. It's like we're saying it's really the end, right? Really dragging us. The end. We're really dragging ourselves to resolution by using the 7th chords. So, why do 7th chords feel unstable like that? Why do they feel like they need to move? Well, a 7th chord is built off, the reason why I call this a dominant 7th. So for instance, if we take a look at this G7, that's a G dominant 7. That's a G major 7. And I love major 7 chords. They're some of my favorite chords on the face of the earth. I absolutely love me a major 7 chord. But that is far more stable than G7, than G dominant 7. So what's the difference? A G major 7 has all of the notes within the chord. All the chord tones belong to the key of G. They belong, I shouldn't say the key of G. They all belong to the G major scale. They all belong to the G major scale, which is part of why it sounds so stable. If we flat the 7, that flattened 7th, that dominant 7th, doesn't belong to the G major scale. It actually belongs to the G dominant scale, which is why we call it a dominant 7th. G dominant or G mixolydian scale. And the G dominant 7th chord is actually built as a 7th chord from the G dominant scale or the G mixolydian scale, which has F instead of F sharp. F sharp belongs in the G major scale. F belongs to the G dominant scale or the G mixolydian scale. Because G is the 5 chord, and 5 chords are technically the dominant chord. If we look at the scale degrees and we use their names instead of just their numbers, there goes tonic is the 1 chord. Supertonic is the 2 chord. Mediant is the 3 chord. Subdominant is the 4 chord, and dominant is the 5 chord. And then, of course, you have the submediant is the 6 chord, and the leading tone is the 7 chord. But so the 5 chord, though, is dominant. that is the dominant chord tone. Dominant chord in the scale, in the harmonized scale. So when you make a seventh chord, you actually use the dominant scale. One of the purposes of the dominant chord, the 5 chord, is its strong pull back to the 1 chord, back to the tonic. You were emphasizing that by adding that dominant 7th. The dominant 7th also feels unstable and like it needs to move somewhere because it has a tritone in it. It has 2 minor thirds stacked on top of each other, and so it has that tritone that but that's another topic. That's another, well, it's anyways, I'm not going to go into that right now. But that's another reason why it feels unstable. You can just file that away in the back of your head, and we'll explain it in a different video perhaps. But that needs to go somewhere. And going back to the tonic, going back to C, that feels real good. So if we were to do, and so with using the 5th of the 5th concept, we're going D7 because D is the 5th degree of G, of the G major scale, right? So G, B, G, A, B, C, D. D is the 5th. So, and again, being the 5th, being the dominant chord in the G major scale, if we make it a 7th chord, we make it a dominant 7th. And that's how we come up with D7. And that wants to resolve back to G. So you hear how satisfying that is. And then, but we also can disrupt that satisfaction, make it less satisfying, and force it back to the C by going from a dominant 7th chord to a dominant 7th chord back to the 1 chord. So 5 dominant 7 to 5 dominant 7 to 1. So we're using this 5th of the 5th, and we're using dominant 7th chords to really pull you along. You can hear that D, G, C doesn't have as strong a pull as D7. D7, G7, C does. It doesn't have as strong a pull to it. At least it doesn't to my ear. So that's how that borrowed chord works. The 5th of the 5th is a borrowed chord. We're borrowing the 5th degree of the 5th degree. We're borrowing that chord and using it within the key of C to create that tension, to create that movement. Okay, I know that this has been a lot, and I know that there's probably questions. So if you have questions, and I apologize for the super long video, but if you have questions, feel free to throw them down below in the comments, and I will do my best to answer whatever you may need. So until the next tutorial, happy picking, y'all.